John Singer Sargent, American artist who spent the bulk of his career in Europe, made a significant break from the portraits with which he was associated during World War I. Witnessing the horrors of war and inspired by a request from Britain's Prime Minister to paint a work capturing Anglo-American support for each other during the war, Sargent was moved in 1918 to capture on canvas a scene of wounded soldiers. While not addressing Anglo-American support, the work does majestically reflect one of the more disturbing elements of World War I, the use of gas warfare. In Sargent's painting, titled Gassed, we see a line of near life-size British soldiers making their way to an aid station. They have been exposed to a mustard gas attack in the final weeks of World War I. The attack has left them blinded, some possibly only temporarily, others possibly permanently. An aid worker tries to guide them as they hold on to each other's shoulders to determine where they are to go. In this manner, Sargent brings to mind a military parade, yet in this case the soldiers march in a single file reflecting the results of war. Scattered around them are other wounded soldiers, all of whom have bandaged eyes suggesting that they too have been blinded as a result of a gas attack. And then, further back, yet another line of soldiers advances, also led by an aide. Adding to the overall mood, Sargent depicts the scene as he saw it in real life, at dusk, as the sun sets, and in an impressionistic manner bathes the wounded in soft light. The dominant scene is aligned almost perfectly with photographs from the war of soldiers blinded in gas attacks, as seen here. And, as art historians have noted, in all likelihood, Sargent was playing off of Bruegel's the Elder's 1568 painting, The Blind Leading the Blind, where we see a similar line of blind individuals advancing in a line with each person's hands on the shoulder of the person in front of him. With Bruegel's painting tied to the biblical parable from Matthew, when Jesus states, in reference to the Pharisees, "Let them alone, they are blind guides of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch." It is possible a similar connotation resonates in Sargent's work. However, there is possibly another reference to being blind that is harder to see and recognize at first glance. If you look closely in the far background, in the distance, Sargent has included soldiers playing European football or soccer. What an odd juxtaposition to uncover as we are overwhelmed by the effects of a mustard gas attack and see soldiers suffering, to only then move to the background and find soldiers playing. The soldiers are unaffected by the wounded that are nearby. In a sense, they have become blind to this suffering. War has possibly made them numb to scenes that would shock those less experienced in witnessing the results of brutality. This inclusion of soldiers playing soccer could also very likely refer to an event that unfolded during Christmas 1914, just months after the war had begun. During the war's first Christmas, several areas of the Western Front witnessed an informal truce occur as enemy soldiers wandered out into the area between the trenches known as No Man's Land, and they fraternized in that area. They exchanged news, shared food, and even started impromptu soccer games. Thus, the paradox Sargent includes in his painting actually happened. In the midst of war, enemy combatants took time off from the war and played soccer or football with each other. So what forces brought about the use of such a horrific weapon as poisonous gas? Basically, what it comes down to was the war's fairly quick devolution into a war of attrition as static trench warfare came to dominate the war as opposed to the war being a war of mobility. In the years leading up to the war, Germany had developed a plan should it find itself in a two-front war involving Russia, France, and Britain. The plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, named after the strategist who devised it, revolved around the different mobilization times related to Russia, France, and Britain. According to the plan, Germany would attack France first, as it would take Russia the longest to mobilize. The plan involved defeating France in a matter of weeks before large numbers of British forces would make their way across the English Channel to support France. Once France was defeated and the English threat neutralized, Germany could focus on Russia just as Russia was mobilizing its troops. So central to this plan was a rapid defeat of France. In order to accomplish this, the Schlieffen Plan called for Germany to attack France not directly across their shared border, which is where France anticipated a German attack, but rather to attack France by going through Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The issue of concern, however, was that dating back to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, major European powers had agreed to respect Belgian neutrality. The Schlieffen Plan called for Germany to abandon that century-old agreement. In the end, this became a major factor contributing to Great Britain's entry into the war against Germany. By invading France by moving through Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, Germany, the Schlieffen Plan argued, would be able to encircle French troops, attack Paris, and force France to quickly surrender. Mobility was the key. So long as German troops moved quickly and avoided prolonged engagements, France would fall, England would be unable to send significant aid, and Germany would then send troops fighting in France to meet the Russian threat, just as Russia was fully mobilizing. The dreaded two-front war would be avoided, and by taking its enemies out piecemeal, Germany would be able to fight, in essence, two one-front wars. In theory, this was a sound plan. However, the Schlieffen Plan was created in 1905, 9 years before World War I began. In that period, other German strategists questioned whether or not the German forces left to guard the common French-German border would be strong enough to keep the French from successfully invading Germany. Due in part to this fear, Helmut von Moltke, the German commander overseeing what would become the Western Front, moved German troops away from his right flank, the flank charged with actually invading France, in order to strengthen his left flank, the flank intended to prevent France from invading Germany. The result of this was that the troops dedicated to taking Paris were weakened and unable to maintain the momentum they needed to achieve their objective. After a flurry of activity and movement, and near success on the part of Germany as the German military reached the outskirts of Paris, the invasion was stopped and pushed back a bit. Both sides then began digging trenches to fortify their positions, and by early 1915, from the English Channel to Switzerland, the armies occupied a massive network of trenches. Mobility was gone, and the Western Front began to witness horrific charges across no man's land as both sides attempted to break through the opposing forces' trenches. Yards, by no means miles, were gained and lost continually, with huge losses of life. As for Russia, with Germany's inability to defeat France, it barely was able to transfer troops to meet the Russian threat, and Germany ended up fighting what it never wanted, a two-front war. With trench warfare defining the war on the Western Front, and with the war devolving into a war of attrition, both sides looked to technology to try to gain an advantage that could bring victory. The airplane, for example, was weaponized. It was able to fly behind enemy lines in order to determine where troops were concentrated and where weak points in the lines might have been. With planes scouting enemy troop placements, other planes would intercept and try to shoot them down. Eventually, another innovation that had emerged in warfare before World War I, the machine gun, was added to planes. The Germans were the first to effectively use the machine gun on planes as they designed a mechanism that prevented the gun from firing when the propeller was lined up in front of the gun. Thus, the device allowed pilots to shoot the machine gun without fear of tearing up their own propellers. On the ground, the machine gun proved deadly as troops were exposed to fire as they advanced across no man's land toward the enemy. Well-placed machine guns could mow down soldiers easily. Even airplanes could use the machine gun against ground troops as they strafed trenches. And of course, it was during World War I that planes began to carry bombs to drop on troops and cities. Even larger Zeppelins were used to carry bombs deep into enemy territory. Armored fighting vehicles, or tanks, made their debut during World War I due to trench warfare. The tank provided wonderful protection for troops as they advanced across no man's land, and they incorporated a unique design to be able to roll over trenches. However, they were not invulnerable as artillery fire could take them out, and they tended to be slow and not be able to carry the momentum needed to break through row upon row upon row of trenches. It would take a couple of decades before technological innovations and effective armored tactics would be developed to make the tank a formidable force on the battlefield. While other innovations came to bear on the war to break the stalemate, including the submarine, the submachine gun, and the flamethrower, the weapon that resonates arguably most with the war is the use of poisonous gas. And that lets us return to Sargent's depiction of soldiers wounded in a gas attack. The Germans were the first to use gas during the war, first on the Eastern Front against the Russians. However, the cold caused the gas to slightly solidify, thus it did not do any damage. But in 1915, near Ypres, Belgium, the Germans launched a successful gas attack that, had they been better prepared, could have allowed them to break through the enemy's lines. From that point on, soldiers made sure to keep their gas masks at their side as both sides used poisonous gas against each other. In the end, it was America's entry into the war that allowed the stalemate to end. Germany's gamble of unleashing Lenin on Russia to start a communist revolution that would take Russia out of the war, and their reintroduction of unrestricted submarine warfare failed to achieve the results the Germans wanted. America's entry into the war tipped the scales in favor of the Allies, and on the 11th day of the 11th month, at the 11th hour, an armistice was signed in 1918, bringing an end to the war that was to end all wars.